Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is always one I love to film, and that is popular books that I think are worth the hype. There are truly an infinite amount of book recommendations across so many different platforms. It can at times be difficult to sift through if a book is actually worth all the hype it's receiving. So today I have 7 books that I personally think are worth all of the praise that they receive, popular across all platforms. I love all these books. I stand by all these books. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book I'm going to be chatting about is honestly very much a 'tis the season read. This book is popular at all times. I do feel like at this time of year, it really creeps back up into popularity, as it should. And that book is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is Leigh Bardugo's adult fantasy debut, and it's also a dark urban fantasy story centering dark academia and a cult. Honestly, a winning combination if you ask me. Going into this book personally, I was honestly not too sure what to expect. In the past, I've read a lot of Leigh Bardugo books. Some of them I've loved, some of them I've just found to be okay. And honestly, I feel like this book was excellent and lives up to all of the hype. It does have quite a long list of trigger warnings though, so I would look into those before picking it up. But this book follows our main character, Alex. And Alex, after dropping out of school and basically running away from home, she has been living a very hard life, kind of with deadbeat boyfriends and kind of running in circles with drug dealers. She's also the only survivor of a really gruesome and horrific multiple homicide event. At her lowest, Alex, while laying in her hospital bed, is offered a second chance at life. And that is, she's kind of hired by some sort of mysterious individual to move to New Haven and start attending Yale in their freshman class and basically become involved in and also investigate all of the different sort of occult activities that are happening on campus. Specifically, there are 8 groups that exist here, and all of them are kind of involved in different ways with magic. Alex herself is just struggling to stay afloat in all of her classes. She doesn't really understand why she has to investigate all of these groups of just greedy, nepotistic kids. But as she begins to investigate a bit deeper, she begins to realize there might be some truth behind this magic, and as murders begin to occur on campus, she is very much pulled in. I loved this book. Alex as a main character is absolutely fantastic. She centers this book so well. Obviously, the setting is just great outside of just the ambiance of the occult, secret society, dark academia setting. There's also just this critical eye that Leigh Bardugo weaves into this story, which I personally prefer when reading stories centering dark academia. This book is gruesome, it's gritty, it's full of magic and a lot of mystery as well. I honestly was hooked in this book. The sequel is actually coming out, I want to say early 2023. It truly blew me away. I think it's worth all the hype. 5 stars, also a great time of year to pick this book up if you haven't yet. The next book is, I feel like for many, like a beloved childhood favorite. I personally didn't read this until very, very recently, and I think 1, it completely stands up to all the hype, and 2, it's completely worth picking up even if you didn't get to it growing up, and that is Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier. I have discovered this year that I just adore Juliette Marillier's writing. It's beautiful, it's lush, it's honestly cottagecore fantasy to a T, just full of magic and quests and strong female heroines. It also centers romance in such an excellent fashion. There's also just so much heart and emotion within these books. They're just impossible to put down. I love Juliette Marillier's writing so much, and I can see why her books have stood the test of time. The Daughter of the Forest is book 1 to a Juliette Marillier trilogy following our main character, Sorcia. And she lives in the Seven Waters Kingdom with her 6 brothers. They're all very, very close, and Sorcia herself kind of lives a bit like a wild child. She's been formally educated, she doesn't have too many rules, she kind of runs wild in the forest and pursues things that interest her. At the beginning of this book, though, everything changes when her father decides to remarry and bring his new wife to the kingdom itself. Quickly, she realizes that something is wrong with his new wife, and she actually casts a curse on the entire family. And from there, it's up to Sorcia to go on a quest and basically try to save the ones she loves most. And the quest itself is absolutely harrowing, and just the perseverance and everything surrounding our main character is just truly so admirable. Structurally speaking, I would say this book is very, very classic, like medieval fantasy. It has a very traditional sort of quest structure, but the writing of this book is excellent. And the characterization and just the devotion you feel Sorcia has for her family is just truly so believable. I loved book 1, I loved book 2. I'm committed not only to these characters, but this world. They're just amazing, to be honest. And if you love like very atmospheric, beautifully written, quest structured fantasy stories with romance, I highly recommend checking out The Daughter of the Forest. Speaking of a beautifully written book, the next book I have to recommend is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is probably one of the most talked about books, at least on my channel. I feel like I'm constantly trying to recommend it wherever and however I can, because I truly think this is just one of the best books that have come out in years. I loved it. It crossed all of the T's, dotted all the I's for me personally, and the fact that this book has a 4.2 with over 100,000 ratings on Goodreads, clearly many people love this book as well, and I think it deserves all the hype it gets completely. But this is a standalone fantasy novel written by Naomi Novik, and it's actually a retelling of the story Rumpelstiltskin. It centers 3 female main characters. The first character is Miriam, the daughter and granddaughter of moneylenders, historically in her family. However, her father is very kind-hearted. He's actually very bad at his job, and the townspeople take advantage of not only him, but their entire family. On top of that, being a moneylender is also a profession that is deeply looked down upon, so Miriam and her family face a lot of prejudice, not only for their job, but also for their religion. To try to save her family, though, Miriam creates a rumor that she's able to spin silver into gold, attracting a very powerful fairy king. And when he confronts Miriam, he sets her an impossible challenge. The other main character we follow is actually a farmhand's daughter who is sort of connected with Miriam herself. And then the last main character we follow is Irina. And Irina is a part of a sort of aristocratic family, and she is treated rather poorly by her family because she is not considered very beautiful, so they don't think they're going to be able to get her a powerful or wealthy match. But at the beginning of this book, her father decides to try to scheme to get her married to the Tsar, but the Tsar is not who he seems, and it creates a very dangerous situation for her. This is a story of young women trying to take on the mantle of their own life, their own fate, also confronting so many obstacles put in front of them by society, and it's truly just not only incredibly written, it also has the perfect combination of like history and fantasy, and it's so well done in my opinion. This book is absolutely gripping. If you love like modern fairy tales, this is such a great book to pick up. It's also a standalone. It also has quotes from Ursula Le Guin, Robin Hobb, Cassandra Clare, Patrick Rothfuss, John Gwen. I mean, need I say more? Robin Hobb loves this book. Everyone's got to read it. Next up is a literary fiction option that absolutely knocked my socks off. That book is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. This book is incredible on all fronts, from the writing to the plotting and just honestly every aspect of it. Britt Bennett is a force, and I plan to read pretty much every book she ever plans to put out from now until the rest of time. The book has gotten a lot of praise, and it's all completely warranted. If you haven't for some reason read this book, I highly recommend checking it out. But this is a story that explores racism and colorism in the United States, and specifically we're following 2 identical twin sisters growing up in the 1950s in a Black community in the South. In this community, being fair-skinned is celebrated, whereas having a darker complexion is vilified. These 2 sisters grow up incredibly close together, but as they reach early adulthood, they run away from home and basically start to take 2 separate paths. One sister moves to a white community, marries a white man, and spends the rest of her life passing as a white woman. The other moves away and marries a Black man, but ultimately actually moves back home to the small community they both swore they would never return to. This story spans from the 1950s to the 1990s, following not only the mother's story, but also both of their daughter stories as well, how they're still intrinsically completely connected, and you see sort of the intersecting aspects of their lives, not only between the sisters, but their daughters as well. This book is emotional, it's beautifully written, and honestly compelling from page 1. I really enjoyed reading this book, and again, I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't read it yet to do so. Next book I have to recommend is a fantasy series that I completed this year, and I was nervous about all the hype myself. That is the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, the first one being The Blade itself. This is one of the most beloved trilogies in the fantasy space. People love Joe Abercrombie, and I, until late last year, had not read any books by this author at overall, and I'm happy to report they are definitely worth the hype. I loved this trilogy so much, and I also cannot wait to check out more books that exist within this world. Abercrombie just creates such an interesting, grim, dark fantasy story that is very, very character focused, and because he spends so much time developing these characters, specifically in book one, giving us background on their lives, their motivation, their quirks, and the fact that all of them are not really great people, you feel so rooted in their point of view that as the plot begins to develop and really explode, you're so committed to the characters themselves and you're so excited to see how the plot itself is going to unfold, making it such an addictive fantasy series to read. But if you're not familiar, the First Law trilogy follows kind of a multitude of characters. Again, all of them are kind of bad people, making their actions and motivations very hard to pin down, also making a very surprising story too. The first main character is Glokta, who was once a very handsome and famous soldier, but during the war he was captured and tortured, and upon his arrival back home, his life and his body was forever changed, and now he kind of tortures people for a living and is heavily involved in politics. Then we have Logan, who is from the north. He's kind of part of this warrior band. He fights for a living. And at the beginning of book one, he sort of randomly decides to travel south and join up with this magician who tells him it's his sort of destiny to tag along with him. And then lastly, we have Giselle, a young and pompous and honestly mediocre soldier who really just wants to drink and hang out with a bunch of ladies. All of these characters' lives and paths unexpectedly intersect throughout this entire trilogy. This book is bloody, full of shifting political alliances, war, and just the feeling that the stakes are ever increasing. It's so hard to put down. Such great characters, such great plotting, so entertaining. I loved my introduction to Joe Abercrombie. Highly recommend checking him out, and I think he is worth all of the hype, and I know he gets a lot. Next book I think is worth all of the praise it receives is Beartown by Fredrik Backman. Fredrik Backman is one of the most popular contemporary writers of our time. He writes such great character-focused stories full of heart and emotion. I've read a few books by him, and I would say my favorite so far is Beartown. Beartown is a story that centers a tiny community in the woods of Sweden. Here, hockey is king, and the town itself is kind of struggling. There's less jobs, there's less opportunity, but there is a bit of hope in the air as the junior hockey team has made it to the semifinals, and if they win, it could bring a lot of economic opportunity for the town. So needless to say, there is a lot of pressure put on the shoulders of a bunch of teenage boys. However, in the background of this very important hockey tournament, one girl is left traumatized, sort of splitting the town in half and leaving the town in complete turmoil. This is a story about community, it's about loyalty, it's about commitment to what is right. It is a heartbreaking story. It is a character-focused story that will absolutely break you. I sobbed reading this book. I love Fredrik Backman's writing style, particularly in this story, because his commitment to like capturing the feeling of a town was just paramount. You were constantly shifting and bleeding from one point of view to another. You could be in one scene reading from 4 different point of views by the time you leave it. You just have this feeling of this interconnectedness of so many different people in this community, and it works so well, from the hockey players that are on this team to a family directly attached to it to just other community members as well. Even if they only have a few pages, you quickly feel like you're following at least into an aspect of their life. I will also say this book does center hockey, and I know literally nothing about hockey, yet I was absolutely hooked in all of the action hockey scenes that were written in this book. They're really, really engaging, so don't let the fact that this does heavily center sports be a turnoff, because it's still very, very engaging, I promise. But really, at the end of the day, this is a story about a community, about a group of people. You will find yourself completely nestled into it as well. This book has a lot of trigger warnings, so I would say please look those up before reading this book. It's just so well written, and I feel like Fredrik Backman approached this style of story with such care, and I personally really, really enjoyed it. And the last book I have to talk about, to me, has to be one of the most hyped books of 2022. I just feel like there hasn't been a release that, at least personally, I've anticipated this highly in so long. Not to mention, I feel like the internet was right alongside with me, and that book is Babel by Arv Kuog. This literally just came out, but I do feel like it is everywhere. I have read it, I have loved it. I have a whole video sharing my reading experience of this book, but this was an absolute home run by Arv Kuog, and wow, what expectations to live up to and honestly exceed so impressive. If you're not familiar, Babel is a fantasy standalone following our main character Robin. At the beginning of the story, it opens in 1828 and we follow Robin as he's basically taken from his home in China, brought to England by a very mysterious professor. There, he's immediately put into schooling, very intense schooling to learn Greek and Latin, all in preparation for one day to be enrolled into the Royal Institute of Translation, otherwise known as Babel. Once Robin arrives at Oxford, he is excited to hopefully meet his peers, fit in, as since living in England, he's basically been othered his entire life, but he quickly realizes that the nepotism and racism that existed just generally in England obviously exists here as well. Though Robin loves learning and he does make friends, especially at this institute, he quickly realizes that Babel is actually a tool by the British Empire itself, used to basically pursue their colonial interests around the world, and by helping them hurts places like his motherland. So Robin kind of finds himself very, very torn and actually falls into rebellion, more specifically student rebellion. This book honestly is a feat. The amount of world building and character building that R.F. Kuang was able to fit into a standalone novel was incredible. Robin as a main character you will fall in love with. He is one to root for, and just following his life story is agonizing, and you just understand the rage that he feels throughout his entire life, and watching him kind of harness that, pursue that, is honestly very admirable in so many different ways. This book heavily centers language, the construction of language, the learning of language, the application of language, and also consists of a lot of footnotes throughout the story, kind of fleshing out a lot of the academic statements and references that are used throughout the book. And honestly, I loved that aspect of this. Robin also has a group of close friends, and their dynamic is fascinating all in itself. And on top of all of that, there's also a really interesting magic system that is perfectly woven into this world. It's truly just so successful. In Babel, R.F. Kuang not only eviscerates the world of academia, and while yes, this is technically a fantasy story, the historical setting that this book is set in and the real world influences that R.F. Kuang is pulling from is not fantasy. It is our real world, it is our real history, and how she's able to mash those two things together. It honestly created, as Rebecca Roanhorse says on the cover of this book, a masterpiece. You won't be able to put it down. It just truly was so engrossing. I loved it so much. Worth all the hype. Buy this book this year. You're gonna love it. Alrighty guys, those are 7 popular books that I think are worth the hype. Let me know down below some popular books that you personally love, as I would love to know, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye.